Hey everyone, welcome to Everything Women's Wrestling, the FloWrestling podcast where we talk about everything women's wrestling. I'm your host, Lori Ayres. This is episode 4. Today we are going to be talking to 3 of my favorite people in women's wrestling: Julia Salata, Jacque Davis, and Kyra Barry. Last week, Julia Salata was able to attend the NCAA Convention and actually present during the Women's Emerging Sports Status session. So she talked about all kinds of different things: high school, college, diversity in women's wrestling, competition opportunities. And today we're going to get on the show, and she, along with Kyra and Jacque, are going to present what was presented at that emerging sports session. By the way, to a packed room of athletic administrators. So we're going to get to know these ladies better, and we're going to hear all about what was presented. So let's go hear about it. All right. We have lots of lady boss energy today on Everything Women's Wrestling. How's everyone doing?
Good.
So good.
Right,
Not too bad.
Thank you guys so much for coming on today. We have some big news from this weekend with girls and women's wrestling, with Iowa announcing that they're sanctioning. So what'd you guys think about that?
That's crazy.
You know, it took me a little bit by surprise because I know they've been working hard, and it, you know, just the nature of the state, it wasn't an easy thing to do. And, you know, so I was really, really excited because I hadn't heard anything of that coming. So it came as a really, really pleasant surprise. Just on top of, I don't know why it continues to, you know, I continue to be like, wow, you know, like, you know, Iowa State adding a club, you know, it's the state, you know, so many, the championships keep coming, the new clubs keep coming, the new teams keep coming. I feel like every week there's something new, and every week I'm like, wow, that's so great. You know, just it's just on such an upward trend.
Yeah, and I think I was like, I know people had been working on it for a really long time. And so it was like kind of quietly, or maybe not so quietly, being worked on for a really long time. And then seeing snippets of the tournament, the state tournament this past weekend too, with it was over 700 girls competing in that tournament. That blew my mind. That's insane. You know, like, it's crazy to me that it took getting to like 1,000 wrestlers in the state and 700 girls competing at the state tournament before it became sanctioned or approved.
Right, and especially in a state that's as wrestling crazy as Iowa, you know, they're seen as the crown jewel of both high school and collegiate wrestling in a lot of circles, and to see them finally acknowledge that these girls are legitimate and that they have a place in the sport is so huge. And I think it kind of puts a fire under the butt of some of these other states as well, letting them know that this is what needs to happen. This is where the sport is heading. This is our trajectory, and people need to get on board. Obviously, we're all super passionate about it, and we feel that way. And we're just slowly convincing more and more people that this is such a great opportunity for these girls. And to see Iowa recognize that is so huge for us, for the entire state sanctioning movement, really.
Yeah, right. I mean, I feel like last week was Ohio, and now this week was that last week, right? It was last week. I'm updating graphics like constantly.
I know. Yeah, I almost sent you a text this morning, like, Glory, time to change the slideshow.
I did, by the way.
Yeah, so. Good problem to have, right?
Yeah, no, it is. All right, so lots of exciting things. We had our first Ivy League match this weekend too, which was awesome to watch, between Princeton and Columbia. First women's match ever. Kyra, I know you were at UNC this weekend, right?
Yeah. It was alumni weekend down there. My son is on the team, so I went down to see Duke and UNC wrestle. Great there, and just connect with parents. What was really exciting is, you know, they've got a number of women in the room. You know, Macy Kilty's on the senior circuit, circuit, as well as, but more exciting is Marisol Nugent transferred there this year, as she's matriculated as an undergraduate at UNC, and is wrestling on the team and in the room, as well as they have another woman, Chloe, who is there as well. So it was so wonderful to see the interactions and to watch an open practice, and to see, you know, more girls in the room, and more than that, to see how warmly they're received, not only by the coaches but by their teammates, and they have to earn it. Marisol was awarded one of the athlete prizes, or the athlete prize of the week, and a number of the teammates got up and spoke about how they'd seen her really tough it out, how it hadn't been easy, many times being the only girl in the room, and how impressed they were with her. And we just know that the more people see women in the room, the more they know that they belong there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We all love Marisol. So good to hear that she's doing so great. All right. So before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the podcast, why don't we just go around and do some quick intros for each of you guys. So if you don't mind, just sharing a little bit about your wrestling history and how you're currently involved with women's wrestling. So Kyra, since you were telling us about Marisol, why don't you kick it off for us?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm the newbie to wrestling, I think, although I'm the oldest one here. But I got involved as heading up Beat the Streets in New York City, really based on my not-for-profit experience. And I really got passionate about girls wrestling because here we were trying to rebuild wrestling in New York City. And we had hundreds of girls coming out to wrestle, and it wasn't because they saw it. There wasn't a strong culture necessarily. It wasn't that their brothers and fathers were wrestling. And I was shocked, this was in 2010, to learn that only 4 states recognized girls wrestling as a high school sport, yet it was an Olympic sport already now for about 6 years. And so I've been involved with the women's senior team as team leader for USA Wrestling for the 2016 Olympics in Rio, and now spend a lot of my time just advocating at the college level. We've got to add those college programs so these women have the same choice as the men do in terms of the breadth of academic choices as well as continuing to wrestle in, and also been part of this effort to add state championships. So we've got 16 left, and I'm hard at work and making sure that New York State is going to be the 35th.
Well, we know that you are hard at work because we see it every single day and are so grateful for you. So, all right, Jacque, you're up next.
Oh my goodness. Well, thanks for having me back, Lori. I actually grew up in California, started wrestling when I was in middle school, joined the team in 7th grade. My dad did not wrestle. I do not have any brothers. So obviously they didn't wrestle. I just didn't know it existed until I heard about it on the loudspeaker one day, and like that there were open tryouts and anybody could come. And I was like, sweet, I'm going. So I ended up joining in middle school, fell in love with it, like absolutely obsessed with it, wrestled through middle school, high school, and eventually wrestled at Menlo College for the late Lee Allen, and as well as Marcy Van Dusen. And then Marcy was a really impactful person in my life, and she actually connected me to Kyra and connected me to Beat the Streets New York. And so I moved from California to New York, and then I started working in sports and in wrestling professionally for Beat the Streets New York as the women's program director. And I was there from 2013 or 2014 till 2018, and then kind of continued my career in New England with Beat the Streets New England. And now I'm in Maryland, and I'm working with Kyra, with Lori, with Emma Randall, with Julia on trying to get more opportunities for women at the D1 level.
Love it. Love it. And I do not meet a female wrestler that does not adore you. So, if your college coach has had an influence on you, you are certainly having a big influence on all of the athletes now. So we're so grateful for you too. And I just love you as a person. All right, moving on to Julia.
All right, so I started wrestling when I was 14. When I was a kid, from the time I was probably 7 or 8, I was a huge WWE fan. The Undertaker is my favorite wrestler. I thought he was awesome, and I would like recreate it in my basement with my friend Eric, like all the time. I was an only child. I grew up with all boys in my neighborhood, so I was always playing tackle football. Like, I was a rough kid, you know. And at the end of my 8th grade year, they were giving middle school wrestling a shot in my district. They'd never had it before. And I brought home a flyer, and I was like, Mom, I want to wrestle. And she's like, this isn't what you watch on TV. Like, this is not the Undertaker, Tombstone, pile driving people. I'm like, I know, I understand. Like, I watched Going to the Mat. It's a Disney Channel movie. I know it's different. And she's like, all right, fine, do what you want. Started joining the team, and at the end of this kind of 6-week trial run period, they had a middle school city championship with all the schools in the district, and I ended up winning against all guys. And at that point, that tournament was held at the high school that I was going to be attending. at the conclusion of the event, the high school coach approached my parents and he said, hey, I've never had a girl on the team, but I think she has a future in the sport and I'd love to have her, and just know that she's welcome here, which back in 2007 was not the norm. To not only be accepted, no questions asked, but to have a coach approach a female wrestler's parents and say, like, she has this place on my team and I would love to have her. So I got to high school and, I was a 3-sport athlete. I was playing volleyball in the fall, and when winter rolled around, I'm like, I think I want to keep going and see where I can go with the sport. And once I was in a full structured season, at the high school level, I was hooked instantly. That kind of just catalyzed my entire career. I wrestled all 4 years at King University. I spent 10 years wrestling on the U.S. national team. I just retired this past September, and actually coached collegiately for the past 5 years at King University as well. I just stepped down recently, and now I'm focused full-time on the advocacy side of things. I've been working for Wrestling a Girl since September of 2019 on collegiate initiatives primarily. I do a little bit with state sanctioning. I do a little bit with some dual teams, things like that. But my primary responsibility is collegiate initiatives, and more specifically, the NCAA landscape. And like Jackie mentioned, a lot is happening at the D1 level, trying to get more D1 programs added. We became an emerging sport back in 2020, and we're getting very close to being eligible to become a championship sport. So just kind of keeping an eye on all those things, making sure we're headed in the right direction. And that's my full-time focus now. And I'm excited to still be involved with the sport in a very different capacity than what I've been doing as an athlete, but still being able to work in a way that something my passion aligns with. And that's really exciting for me.
Well, it's clear that you are passionate about it, and we rely on you heavily to give us all the information we have no idea about. All right. Well, so Julia, last week you went to the NCAA Convention and you presented at the Women's Emerging Sports session to a group of athletic administrators. And so could you start us off, Julia, just telling us a little bit about emerging sports, and obviously women's wrestling is an emerging sport. Are there others, and why is this process important to where we're headed with women's wrestling?
So emerging sports are kind of this middle ground where you're being acknowledged by the NCAA, but you haven't met certain criteria yet for the NCAA to acknowledge you as a championship sport, meaning there's an NCAA funded championship, but the NCAA is overseeing what you're doing. They acknowledge that you're on the right track and that you're in the process of becoming an NCAA sport, I guess, essentially. Like I said, we became an emerging sport in 2020 at the same time as acrobatics and tumbling. So there are now 5 emerging sports total that are in this process, in this transition to championship sports status. Us, acro, triathlon, women's rugby, and equestrian. And you actually have to get approved in all 3 divisions. Each division votes independently of each other. And we were approved unanimously in all 3 divisions back in 2020. Division 2 and 3 voting in January of that year, and Division 1 approving it later that June. So we're actually pretty far ahead of the curve. The other 3 sports, equestrian, triathlon, and rugby, have been at this for a while. They became an emerging sport several years ago and are still trying to get to their 40 number, whereas we're growing so fast that we're already about to become eligible for that championship sports status transition. And I think that's just indicative of the growth that we're seeing across the country at all levels, the youth and high school and collegiate level. And that's a lot of the data that was presented in this session. I mean, we had a packed room at the NCAA convention, and we're able to show all of this data. And I had so many administrators approach me after saying how shocked they were by how fast they were growing. They knew, everyone's hearing now women's wrestling is a growing sport, but to actually be able to see something in front of them about how rapid this growth is and how insane it is, really. They were super impressed by that. I mean, to actually have something tangible to acknowledge when you look at the states that are sanctioned and the numbers, and it's just really telling of where we're at. So it went really well. This was the first time we'd ever been a part of the session in person. Like I said, we became an emerging sport in 2020, so we didn't get to be a part of it that year. And then last year in 2021, the convention was virtual. So we were in that presentation, but it wasn't in person. So this was really the first time that we got to show off, really, in front of these administrators and convince them of what we already know, that we're awesome and great, and that this is such a great opportunity for these schools. And everyone that I talked to was really receptive. They're not going to come up to you and tell you it was awful and terrible either. But the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, which I think is a really good sign, and hopefully leads to more programs being added across all 3 divisions. And I have a lot of follow-up meetings already scheduled, and it was very productive, and I'm excited about what's going to come from it.
Awesome. And there's no better ambassador for our sport than you. And it's so great to hear that the room was packed with administrators eager to listen and hear what we had to present. So basically today we're going to go through that presentation that you gave, Julia, and have each of us talk through some of the slides so that our listeners are up to date with what's being presented. So I'm actually going to just bring up our first slide and get us positioned here. And Kyra, maybe you can walk us through, and then we can have a conversation and everyone can kind of chime in. But can you just sort of walk us through what this slide means and what we're presenting here?
Well, this is just a quick snapshot. I think it's really easy to read. You can see the 34 states that have approved an official championship for girls. And we kind of start with the original 6 states. As I think I mentioned, when I started in 2010, there were actually only 3. Texas and Hawaii had started girls championships early in the late 1990s. It wasn't until 2009. California took a long time to actually get to that championship. And then I believe it was Washington right after, then Alaska. So, and then there was kind of a lull, and this is where we got involved, and really have to point out real quickly that we started really doing a lot of education. And 2 really partners of ours were focused on this beginning in 2014, 2015. I think we'll see later on where that growth came from. But the one thing I want to point out, because this will be relevant later on in the presentation, is that the West Coast, the middle of the country and the West Coast, has been much faster to have official high school championships than the Eastern Seaboard. Part of that has to do with the rules and how you actually get to that point, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And doesn't mean that there aren't girls wrestling there.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add any information about that? I know, Julia, you said that you work a little bit with sanctioning some of the states, like a state like Pennsylvania. They are working super hard. Obviously, Kyra, in New York, you know about that because you're part of that process. So certainly, I've had actually people reach out to the some of the graphics and say, oh, so and so state does have girls wrestling, and so it gets confusing because some of the states that aren't quote unquote sanctioned do hold those state championships and are building towards that. But the state athletic association, is that how it works, Julia? Is not yet saying that they support the championship yet. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. And every state operates a little bit differently, both in terms of how they approve a championship versus a full season or as a recognized sport. They all have their own terminology. Like in NCAA, we use emerging sport. There are some states that use similar terms. And there's no uniform process, right? I mean, we have these task forces that are assembled in various states, and it's a really functional way of doing things. But what we found is that each state has criteria to meet. Like in Pennsylvania, they need 100 teams. Where some states like Alabama, we actually kind of had to slow down a little bit. They wanted a sanction when they had only 40 girls in that state competing, and they wanted to have a full-fledged season. But they were only going to let girls compete against girls. So we actually had to walk it back. So as we kind of go through this process, we're learning that yes, we have a uniform approach, but as each state tells us what they want and what things they want us to be doing and what they want to see metric-wise and numbers-wise, we're kind of having to tailor to each state independently. So each state's a new challenge. They all have their own hurdles and obstacles. Ohio was, seeing tons of red tape, and they finally broke through just last week. So, the competitor in me loves that challenge, but it's also a unique situation where we have to approach each state in a different manner and just kind of work with what they're giving us and do everything we can to make sure that we get that championship approved as soon as possible, so that we can start having the numbers to either get a full season sanctioned or just keep progressing and growing the sport. And that's what it's about, right? Is just making sure that we're getting more girls involved and creating competition opportunities for them as well.
Yeah. And Kyra said, we have 16 to go, so fingers crossed. All right, so Jacque, you want to walk us through?
I can tell you, New York we're going to get there soon. So that's one state I can tell you about.
I know, and you guys, I'm sorry, it's kind of weird with the video here, so we have to move around if you want to get your a face into the screen. But Jacque, do you want to fill us in a little bit here on what this map is about?
Yeah, I mean, again, Lori crushes it with the graphics, so it's pretty self-explanatory. But there's back in this is based off of 2019, 2020 numbers. We had about 28,000 girls at the high school level wrestling across the country. And I think if you're kind of comparing this graphic with the one that Kyra and Julia were just speaking off of, you can kind of see that for the most part, the states that have sanctioned or approved are the ones that have the highest participation numbers. So it's kind of like, if you recognize that girls wrestling exists, if you acknowledge it, if you sanction it, guess what? Girls come out. They flood the wrestling mats. They want to compete. And then, the states that are some of the older states that have sanctioned, California, Hawaii, Texas, they have the most numbers. So they have a little bit longer history of girls knowing that it's an opportunity. So it's pretty impressive. And I see Kyra, New York is up there. It's red, so it's ready to go.
Well, and that just goes to the point of what Julia said. Each state has different rules, New York has a lot of girls wrestling. It's just the rules to getting to a championship sport are what they are. And I think in the long run, frankly, I think it's going to make it an even stronger program. And once we get to that point, we will have a foundation in place that will really allow it to grow super fast, and that will really benefit the girls. It's just a longer ramp to get there. And I mean, you look at even the whole East Coast, the numbers, they're strong numbers, and they're growing all the time. I think we're going to see at the end of this year, when the NFHS comes out with their participation numbers, I think a lot of these states, even in the East Coast where you don't have a girls' championship, are really going to jump up.
Yeah,
from everything anecdotally that you're hearing.
And to that point, I mean, we've seen a lot of growth, obviously, over the years. So Julia, like when you talked about this slide, I mean, we, like Kyra said, we are. Oh gosh, I'm covering up the bottom here, but we've seen it. I think this is actually inaccurate. It says 13 new states. We've had more than that at this point, but so I'll have to correct that one. But yeah, so talk us through a little bit of the growth here, Julia. What'd you say?
Again, good problem to have.
It's
Good problem to have. We have to update slides. Yeah. So this data here is from 2020. One, pre-COVID, but two, back when only 19 states had a sanctioned high school women's tournament. Where we're at now with 34 states that are sanctioned, we know this number is significantly higher. And I'm sure the data at the end of the season will reflect it when we have a chance to look at OPC numbers and all of that. And we see in some cases up to 400% growth just in the first 3 years alone after a state sanctions. And that's on the high end, but it's not on the extreme high end. I mean, that's kind of becoming the norm, that we're not just seeing numbers rise; they're rising exponentially and quickly. And we have the proof. When we're approaching these states and these state athletic associations, they're asking like, well, how do you know? I'm like, well, look at the numbers, man. Like, I mean, and again, we know this, but these aren't wrestling people that we're talking to in a lot of cases. They're high school athletics people. So having them understand what's happening in wrestling is so important. Now that education component is imperative to this working out for us. So, it's proven that these girls want to compete. They want the opportunities. And there are a lot of girls that still don't even know that high school women's wrestling exists. And as soon as it is, and as soon as it's an option for them, they're jumping at that opportunity. And I think we're going to continue to see that happen. And as soon as we hit 50 states, I mean, it's only a matter of time until our numbers, are 10 times this. And that's not an exaggeration. I think there's 240,000 boys competing at the high school level right now. And there's no reason why our girls' numbers can't mirror that very shortly once sanctioning is, ubiquitous across the country. And it's going to be really exciting when that happens. And it's really not as far away as people think right now.
Yeah, and speaking of numbers and where we are at with our different sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think this really, Julia just said it, this is looking back a couple of years ago with only 19 state championships, and we know that the growth is going to be there. And this this is from 14 states championships, that season, 21,000. We know we're well beyond bowling. We should be probably approaching field hockey. Obviously, it's a little harder to predict. COVID definitely made some of the growth a little more complicated, but actually not as much as I would have thought. in certainly in terms of what's happening in terms of states, schools, and colleges and universities adding teams and supporting girls. And I think what Julia said, like we know there are 250,000 boys wrestling across the country. Sometimes that's been higher. The infrastructure is there, the knowledge is there, and in most of our states, our girls are for the majority of their time they're training and competing with the boys. It's generally during the championship part of the season that they're breaking out. Some of the states, it's all girls competition, but we've seen that grow very quickly as well. And again, wrestling is relatively inexpensive sport for schools to provide that opportunity. You need very little gear. You need very little space. It's easy to share. There's no real differences between the boys and girls. And so we really feel, and there are just hundreds of thousands of men and women who have wrestled at this point. It's one of the oldest, scholastic sports in the country, if not the world. It goes back to the first Olympic Games back there in ancient Greece. And there have been women since the late 80s was our first world championship in wrestling. And so a lot of these women are now of an age and stage in their life where they have time to get back to the sport, and they're really excited. And we're hearing, I think, we kind of have this, D1 women's wrestling group. And so a lot of women a lot of people in the sport are knowing who to reach out to if they want to do more, get into coaching, do something in their community to grow the sport. And we're hearing, again, it's almost weekly that we hear from somebody else saying, hey, how can I help? What can I do? And that's exciting to be able to provide a route in all of the communities across the country for all of our former women wrestlers to get back engaged with the sport.
And honestly, Kyra, this is an impressive slide. And just to clarify, this was in 2019, right? The 28,000 number was in 2019 with 14 states sanctioned. And so with 34 now, I mean, what are we thinking this number? I mean, I guess if you're looking at the math, we could be looking at near doubling when we get the numbers towards the end of the season. So it really is something that is growing exponentially. So when it grows at the high school level, we need to offer opportunities at the college level, and we see that happening as well. So
yeah, I think it's confusing. Women's wrestling is probably a little bit confusing to follow, but the associations at the college level, I think, are probably one of the most confusing things to follow. And it's hard to become a women's wrestling fan if you're like, I don't understand what team falls under what. So we have three main kind of varsity associations: the NCAA, the NAIA, and the NJCAA. The NJCAA are junior colleges. All of these programs are competing in freestyle, so Olympic style wrestling, which is different than what most girls are competing and training at in the high school level, right? They're competing and training in folk style. And there's actually another association, I was confused at NCWA or NWCA. I switch them around, but
NC, I think, yeah.
NCWA. Yeah. It's like the club association at the college level, but it's folk style. And so what women's wrestling did kind of from the dawn of time, its existence, is make sure that women were training and competing in freestyle, so that there was an easier transition to senior level and Olympic level kind of opportunities. And we've seen that. I think Julia could speak upon that as a college athlete who did that, as well as a college coach who watched a lot of her own athletes go compete at the senior, national, and Olympic levels. But yeah, so we have, 58 schools underneath the NCAA, and that's D1, D2, and D3. Mm-hmm. We have 43 schools under the NAIA. And then we have 13 schools under the NJCA, the junior college. So it's kind of, and what I think even like 6 months ago, we were like presenting on completely different numbers. So feels like every other day, there's more college programs that are popping up.
And each of these associations have just really recently actually achieved emerging sports status or invitational status. When you think about, how quickly they've grown. And so, Julia, what do we need to know about making that leap from emerging sport to championship? So once we hit like at the NCAA level, for instance, once we hit that magic 40 number that we've all heard about, is it instant? Is it like magic? We go right to championship?
I wish, but not entirely. So we do have to hit that critical mass of 40 programs across Division 1, 2, and 3 combined, at which point we'll be eligible for championship sports status. So what happens then? We have to maintain those 40 programs for one full academic year. So in theory, at the conclusion of this season, we'll have that with 40 programs who all meet certain criteria, including competition dates, participation numbers, or roster sizes. And then we maintain that for one full academic year. At that point, it'll go back to the NCAA Convention that year. So assuming let's say we get it, the 1 year mark would be up in the fall of whatever year. That following January, it would go to the floor of the NCAA Convention, at which point the association will vote on when that championship sport status date will become effective. So not voting on whether or not they're approving it, they're voting on when they're going to have that first championship. And more than anything, that's budgeting. The NCAA operates in 2-year budgeting cycles. So if they're in an off year, it would push that championship back a year, for example. Or because of COVID, they're in a little bit of a hole with all their championships being canceled 2 years ago. So, it's not that they're going to decide it's going to be 7 years out, but it could be a year or 2 or 3 when they make that championship effective. So it is a little bit of a process, but it doesn't mean we're at a standstill. It's just kind of the way things work. It's a process, and it's the way they do it. At that point, we'll have a championship whenever they decide that effective date is. There'll be Division 1, 2, and 3 all combined, much like our current NCWWC is right now. Moving forward, once a division hits 40 programs on their own, they'll split off into their own divisional championship. In the case of women's wrestling, Division 3 will hit first. They're already, pretty close right now, honestly. They'll split off into their own Division 3 national championship, and Division 1 and 2 will make combined. Even if 1 and 2, we got to answer this convention actually. So if once Division 3 splits off, if Divisions 1 and 2 are under that 40 program threshold, that won't hurt us or count against us. We'll still get to have an NCAA championship for those 2 divisions until one of those divisions then hits 40 programs, and those 2 divisions will finally split off as well, and we'll have 3 full divisional championships. So at this point, that's pretty far down the road, but that's kind of the order of operations and what we're looking at in terms of timeline.
Okay. So people are going to have to pause this and re-listen to that like probably 3 or 4 times before they get it, but it's such great information.
It's a lot. And there's things that we needed clarification on a lot. But the big thing that all the sports actually had for the NCAA at the convention last week was that key piece about what happens to those other 2 divisions when they're not at 40 programs when Division 3 splits off. Like what, do you go back to square one? And they said, no, and there is like a time frame that those 2 divisions have to hit 40 programs in. They do put a cap on it, but I'm not sure what it was, but it was super reasonable. It's something that we're going to be fine. So we're in no danger of regressing at any point, realistically.
Okay, and there's one thing I want to make sure listeners understand. So you mentioned the NCWWC. So what is that? What is that?
So that's the National Collegiate Women's Wrestling Championship, which was implemented in 2020. And it was the first time that there was a national tournament held exclusively for NCAA programs. Prior to that, we had the WCWA that was hosting a national tournament, and that was NAI, NCAA, and junior colleges all combined. That's since kind of gone by the wayside, and now there's an NAI Invitational and this NCWWC, the NCAA tournament. And that will essentially be a precursor to our eventual NCAA tournament as well. Additionally, in 2021, we implemented a regional qualifier format for that national tournament, which very closely mirrors that of NCAA men's wrestling in Divisions 2 and 3. So we're already kind of trying to build some things into that championship. So once we make that transition, we're already in alignment with how NCAA wrestling is already currently working on the men's side of things. Trying to give ourselves some legitimacy, some structure, and just trying to make sure that we're showing the NCAA that we're serious about this transition and doing things in a way that, they like to operate.
Got it. And we kind of talked about this, and it's kind of obvious just moving with the slides here that you were presenting, Julia, at the convention. And, so maybe you can walk us through what you shared when you presented this one.
Yeah. So, I think the biggest thing is that, the focus of our group and what we're doing is NCAA, but women's wrestling is exploding across the country collegiately in all three divisions, the NCAA, the NAIA, and the National Junior College Athletic Association. We're growing rapidly, but you can tell from these graphs, we became an emerging sport in 2020, and that growth has just exploded since then. And now the focus turns to Division I, right? We already know that Division II and III have interest. We need to get Division I on board. We currently have only 3 programs, and that's the next step, again, in terms of legitimacy, in establishing ourselves as a legitimate sport within the organization. And we're going to start seeing that happening. I think Iowa was the first domino to fall, and now we just got to keep that momentum moving. Putting ourselves in front of these administrations at these institutions and letting them know that women's wrestling is coming and it's okay to pull the trigger. It's not a risk anymore. It's just a matter of time. And a lot of them want to see a championship before they're willing to pull the trigger, but that's the purpose of this NCWWC. That's why we're doing all of these things, to show that we're on that path, that we're on, going in the right direction, and that this is going to happen. It's not an if, it's not a when. It's not an if, it's a when, and that when isn't too far away now. So we just got to get them to buy into that. And I think now with, like I said, I think that presentation made a big impact on a lot of them, showing that we're not just saying these things because we believe in it. We're saying it because it's real, it's objective. It's not us being biased. This is the state of affairs here. So I think we're going to continue to see those program numbers grow across all 3 divisions, but especially now the NCAA has that emerging sports status tag to go along with it, those numbers are going to continue to explode over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and we do see the NAIA programs also competing with the NCAA. And actually, Kyra, you had asked a question about that recently to see if those dual meets would count towards the competition criteria, and we know they do. So not only do we have 58 NCAA programs, but we have 43 NAIA programs that NCAA programs can also compete with. So lots and lots of opportunities for competition. But here is our NCAA map, Kyra.
Yeah. And I think I want to go back and talk, while we look at this, is also talk about the larger educational landscape, what's going on in higher education in general in this country, and also what's going on, with our youth, the young adults, and what they're facing. And I think, there's, in terms of higher education, we know there are more and more women going to school. There are more and more women who have been active and been playing sports. That overall number is going up. And so, I think also looking at, I think it's important for schools to understand, and I ask the question, how can you best serve your community? And I think adding sports in general does, because we know, and there's more and more, if you look at, what's going on in terms of understanding human growth, that, neurological growth, physical activity is a very important component of staying strong neurologically, as well as in terms of mental health. And it is a lot of creating the whole person, in terms of, some of it's going to happen in the classroom, some of it's going to happen on the playing field. And so I think there's a need for more and more athletic opportunities across our collegiate landscape, and particularly for women, because the number of women in college and the proportion of women in college is growing. And so that's a lot of appetite. And I think for NCAA schools, the fact, as Julia mentioned, the fact that it's a championship sport really gives a lot more incentive for these athletic departments to look at it. And it can't be seen as a zero-sum game. So I just want to, if everybody didn't think back a minute, we paused on that when we looked at the where the high school athletes were, and you would see they're in the middle and the western part of the country. The NCAA schools that housed a varsity wrestling program are predominantly the Midwest and the East. And so there's really a lot of opportunity for growth to serve those kids. Not every kid is going to want to be going across the country for college. They want to stay in their community. They want to stay in their region. And so we really need to look at how can we grow and respond to where these kids are wrestling. For instance, California desperately needs a lot of NCAA wrestling programs. Actually, I would say both men's and women's. Maybe if we're adding the women's, we'll be adding some of the men's, because there are just thousands of kids in high school that are wrestling there. But the landscape is really strong. There's a lot of opportunity. You can take any school and start to pencil out a competitive program. where they compete, as I said. And I guess I'd ask the question about the NAIA schools for how do we get programs started in the West Coast? Well, there are a lot of NAIA schools competing in women's wrestling in the West Coast. So for any NCAA program that wants to start up, they can put together a pretty competitive schedule without leaving their region.
Awesome. And speaking of competition opportunities.
Yeah. Really good lobbying up for it. So, yeah, I think just exactly what Kyra said. Any school that is interested in starting, it doesn't matter, D3, D2, D1, NAIA, there's a pre-existing infrastructure that you can kind of fall into. So I think that's from most of the people that I think we all talk to, there's kind of like a fear. Well, where do we fall into? What do we belong to? What kind of opportunities can our women have? And there are tons. So this is just kind of a list of competition opportunities. So even if you feel like you're in a dry area for D1 schools, there are D2, D3, NAIA, NJCAA institutions that are in those areas as well that you can kind of fold into with dual meets, with open tournaments. And then if you're feeling like you have some girls who or women who are maybe ready, you have USA Wrestling events, you have qualifiers, there's individual national championships. And then, if there are some brave people who want to take a good step for women's wrestling at the college level, then we can start adding more and more women's opportunities side by side with pre-existing men's college tournaments or dual meets. And that's a really great way to get some visibility for the women as well.
Yeah, we were very sad that Midlands got canceled. Everyone was, I think, looking forward to that, but hopefully next year.
I know. I'm like 2 years in a row though, because it was like, we're going to do it in 2020. And then, nothing happened in 2020, and then we're going to do it in 2021. And it's just.
But it does point out to the amount of education stuff, right? Like getting visibility, showing the world that, these women can compete at a very high level. And just so many people don't realize what's happening with women's wrestling. Like we're living it, we're still like, wow, every day, it's every week it's coming at us, and the growth and the improvements and the level of wrestling, and from the youth all the way up. But a lot of people, even as familiar as they may be with wrestling, they just don't see it regularly. And so the visibility, I think, is a really important part, and understanding who's wrestling, right? Like it's, that's, like my experience with Beat the Streets in New York City, girls just, flying out to do it. They all want to try it. And, even looking at our club at Columbia, we have a whole handful of girls on the club who didn't play a sport in college. I mean, in high school. Here they are coming out and they're wrestling, 3-4 times a week. And this has become their community. And they're supporting each other. And I think it's just important that people try and have the opportunity there. And who is anybody else to say that you can't have that opportunity?
Right. And we're going to talk about club opportunities too in a future show soon, because there are some, really viable non-varsity options too for women who want to attend a school that doesn't have varsity programming. So that's soon to come.
Or people who just want to wrestle or try the sport, or, try it in an area. Sometimes people don't want to go all the way to that level, but they love it. And it's the only combat sport that has a varsity expression, really, in many places at the high school and the collegiate level. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as too, because the combat sports have really grown in popularity for both boys and girls.
And kind of switching gears here, we do see a lot of diversity in the sport of women's wrestling, which is also important to note. And so this was part of the presentation. Is that correct, Julia? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so this data here is reflective of our current USA Wrestling membership base for women across all age groups. We know women's wrestling is incredibly diverse. We know about the opportunities, the numbers on first-generation college students, and our diversity data is reflecting that. Additionally, at the 2021 NCWWC, we found that nearly half of our participants identified as non-white. I believe we were at about like 46 or 47%, something like that. So and that's just the NCWWC, but we have reason to believe that that's reflective of the entire collegiate wrestling landscape. And, again, like talking to these schools, they care about that DE&I component, and women's wrestling is a great value add to these institutions for that reason.
So slow down 1 second. So last year at the NCWWC, which is the championship that will eventually be the NCAA, once we get championship status. I know. So you're saying what was the data there at that championship? Because that's for all of our schools, right?
I believe it was right around 46 or 47%. It might have been like 46.6 or something like that, but it was very, very close to 50%.
That's amazing. So
yeah, incredible.
Right. And we're working hard. So what are we up to, Jackie?
Oh my gosh. Well, so there are many, many people all across the country at all levels, from like tots through college, working on making more opportunities for women. So, as Lori mentioned, there's going to be an episode talking about, if a varsity pathway isn't really an opportunity right away at a college level, that there are institutions that are starting with the all or something kind of mindset, right? And it's not like an all or nothing, like we got to get something going. And so women's freestyle wrestling clubs are kind of popping up all over the country at these institutions. We have a lot of really incredible men and women working at the high school level, trying to sanction or get girls wrestling approved within their state. We have things like this, like Julia going and presenting to administrators about our sport and educating about our sport, because it's, admittedly not super easy to follow just because it changes literally every single day. And we're trying to bring more women, into the fold, whether that's like coaching, whether it's being an official, whether it's getting involved at like at an education standpoint, and just moms, aunts, grandmothers, teachers, anybody, getting them looped in, because you don't have to have had wrestling as an experience. You did not have to be a wrestler to contribute to the world of women's wrestling.
Amen on that, I would say. And it's a wonderful, warm community. And it's really about, taking advantage and advocating for other women and opening doors for young people. And I think that's really, really important. And, it's paying it forward. And so the more doors that we can open, I think that's a motivation for all of us, certainly, Julia and Jackie, you've been active, you wrestled. It was a little bit more obvious. And I think Lori and I came to wrestling through our spouses and our children. But we competed. We had the opportunity to compete in other sports, and being able to compete was, a powerful part of my, journey to adulthood and learning skills and who I am and who I continue to be. And, whatever expression that takes and whatever sport it is that grabs somebody, I just think it's important that everybody have, whether it's the folks that like to go out and walk or people who want to throw people on the mat, everybody should, have some kind of physical expression to be part of their, menu and toolkit.
And we do have a lot of people who are helping us, a lot of organizations across the country who are working alongside us. We're actually covering up our D1 women's wrestling here. So I'll move that over for a second. But Kyra, maybe walk us through just really quick some of the organizations that are partnering on this initiative.
Well, geez, our national governing body, USA Wrestling, has been like phenomenal and a phenomenal partner. And I can speak to that. For me, it's been over 12 years that I've worked with them, coming in first with Beat the Streets. And then, when I finished, when I thought I'd finished with Beat the Streets, or it wasn't as intense, I said, I called them up, Rich Bender, and I was like, I really want to get involved and help. I just can't believe it's only 5 states that recognize, or 6 states that recognize girls wrestling. I want to help. And he said, let's figure out a way to do it. And I think he's had an open door for anybody and anything that we've wanted to do. And when there have been kind of complicated situations, the national governing body, including people like Gary Abbott, who's been promoting women's wrestling for, probably, I would say decades at this point, and his heart and everything is in it, and so we're really fortunate to have a national governing body standing with us as our ally in that. Wrestle Like a Girl, that's Sally Roberts. She finished her senior level career, and I don't think she blinked an eye before she turned around. And that's our first real Wrestle Like a Girl. She founded that in 2016, didn't make the Olympics that year, and she's big and bold, and got out there. And that advocacy organization was just so essential to moving the needle. Both at the high school level in terms of grassroots and getting people out there and through social media, but even more important at the collegiate level. And I really think it was Sally. A lot of people have been circling around and talking about, let's get to emerging sports status. Sally put a lot of energy and muscle behind it, and brought a lot of organizations with her to do it. So I definitely want to give a shout out to Wrestle Like a Girl, because they play such an important part of our sport and for women in general. National Wrestling Coaches Association training, supporting coaches, again, getting in, helping us understand the NCAA landscape, and been a consistent partner of ours there, as well as the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, because they really hold all of the hundreds of thousands of wrestling alumni in the country, and beginning to make sure that women are included in all of their activities. They're also very widespread probably throughout the country, as much as USA Wrestling is. Wrestlers in Business, again, they're a fast growing organization. They've got chapters all over the country, really stepping in and partnering with us and partnering with our women and athletes, and making sure that they get the exposures and the opportunities that they're looking to build for current male wrestlers. They're also looking to do it for the women wrestlers. We obviously can't say we wouldn't be anywhere else without the support and leadership of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. What they've done for women's sports, and continue to, and they've got staff there that have been essential in terms of, again, helping us understand the landscape, how to bridge the divide, to use our term, between an Olympic sport like women's wrestling and the NCAA, because there's a lot of things. And so we're grateful to their staff for the support they've given us. And I think all of those organizations for, anytime. And I have to mention, I don't know if we really got into who D1 women's wrestling are, who we are, what we do. We came, we're as sort of a pandemic. We came out of the pandemic. We were a group of women we've been talking kind of informally and working together. An issue would come up in terms of girls wrestling, and we were getting on the phone. And, in the fall of 2020, we got together, and under Lori, really your leadership, like, let's do this. You're really pushing us. We've been, Jackie and I have been working together for 7 or 8 years. We've been circling things together, but really pushing us to, hey, let's make this something. Let's pull together the coaches, and with your skill set in organizing us. Maybe it comes from being a teacher. I wouldn't call us like herding cats, but maybe, before your leadership, it was like, herding a bunch of third graders, like, okay, let's, get on theme, to the point where, and then with your fantastic artistic skills. So to be able to take our words and putting into a graphic where we've got social media, it's so important. A picture is 1,000 words, and everybody's got a lot on their plate right now. So to have a really powerful picture. So D1 Women's Wrestling, we've been around, I'd say 15 months. And we meet religiously every week. I think we actually talk more than that, but we have a standing meeting, and really happy to have Julia joined us. Emma Randall joined us, Bjor up at Beat the Streets, Boston, New England National. She's got so many roles anyway, a former wrestler. And that's been really a big part of, like, thinking, well, waking up, what can we do this week to advance women's wrestling? And there's so much. And I think the other piece of it is having a place where people can come, having a place where USA Wrestling, oh, this popped up. What do you think? Can you advise us? Can you help us think through this problem? Same thing, with the Coaches Association. It's really powerful to have another organization that's waking up every day saying, what can we do better? How can it be better? How can we open the door for more girls and more opportunity?
I think you've led us perfectly, Kyra, into the Jacque Davis flip the script portion of the show. Because I do think it's important to always think what message or call to action can we send to listeners? So what can we be doing, or what do we want to ask people to do to continue to create visibility and momentum on college campuses? And I think, we didn't really talk too much about it, but we do have a discrepancy between the amount of NCAA D2 and D3 programs as compared to D1 programs, right? We only have 3 D1 programs right now. And so what can we do, or what can we advise our listeners to do? Let's just have a quick maybe conversation about that. Do you guys have any words of wisdom for the individuals out there that are listening of how they can get involved to help build momentum and visibility? I think really a lot of it is just creativity, right? Just making sure that you're being intentional and thoughtful of what your capacity is to influence change, and then taking action. Because we said, that difference between being an advocate and a supporter, to really think about, could you answer the question of what do you do, or what can you do, or what have you done to advance the sport, and can you describe it? So that's being more of an advocate, right?
Well, I'll jump in real quick because, I just had this opportunity. As I said, I was at my son's alumni family weekend for his team. And I was talking to some of the other parents, and somebody turned to me, and they had they saw me filming Marisol. I'm not taking pictures of my kid. I'm taking pictures of the women in the room. And then they're like, well, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, this is an opportunity. And, to talk to this other parent. And, I'd say, number one, you follow our D1 women's wrestling social media stuff. But anyway, my point was, what I was going to say was, in that one conversation, we have another advocate, right? And it goes in the combination of educating people and advocating. And I kind of think like, here, I can't tell you how many times I screenshot one of your slides, Lori, and send them on to somebody, because they're like, here's somebody who's living and breathing wrestling for at least 45 years, and they didn't know what was going on, and they got really, really excited. And so they can go back to their alma mater when they go back for their homecoming as an alum, and say, hey, what are you doing with girls wrestling? What are you doing with women's wrestling? That's, more people start just asking the question, hey, what are you doing?
No, but good advice. So basically share resources, right? If you have resources, share them out. So,
yeah.
Just, I think my point was, ask the question, right? Like, I think that's what, ask, wherever you are, ask a question. What's going on with girls wrestling here? What's going on with women's wrestling?
Right. Exactly. All right. And so we're getting a little glitchy, but that's okay. We shared a lot of great information today. It's all good. But we're actually at about an hour. And so that's at my limit pretty much. And I think most people are an hour and then through. So is there anything else that you guys need to share that, you're dying to say before I let you all go? You guys are good?
Yeah.
All right.
This has been awesome. Thank you, Lori. It was so great to be able to talk about what we're doing.
Agreed. So grateful for all you ladies. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thank you, Lori.